Welcome to Theodisc, the podcast of WTC Theology. My name is Kenny Innes, and I want to thank you for listening in. But I also want to ask you another question. Have you ever thought about studying theology but don't feel you can stop everything to commit to a university program? Well, at WTC, we've designed our part-time programs in Kingdom Theology to fit around busy lives. They're accessible to the whole church, they're university validated, and there's a place for you here. Visit our website, wtctheology.org.uk, to find out more. Humility is a deeply biblical virtue which is often mentioned in our Western church culture, but much more rarely lived and demonstrated. That's the argument of the guest for this episode of Theodisc, Reverend Dr. Dennis Edwards, who says humility has been misunderstood, manipulated, or marginalised such that its true nature has been hidden away in a dark corner. But in his book, Humility Illuminated, Dennis wants to recover the biblical roots of humility, its importance for the character of the church, and the way it can bring healing and unity. Reverend Dr. Dennis Edwards holds degrees from Cornell University and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and has an MA and PhD in Biblical Studies from Catholic University of America. He's ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church, has served as a church planter in Brooklyn and Washington, D.C., and has worked in urban ministry for nearly 3 decades. Dennis is the Dean and Vice President of Church Relations at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, where he teaches New Testament. He's also the author of several books including Might from the Margins, Do Black Lives Matter?, The Story of God commentary on 1 Peter, and he's a contributor to the upcoming New Testament in Colour. I hope you enjoy this conversation about his latest book, Humility Illuminated. Reverend Dr. Dennis Edwards, thank you so much for being on the Theodisc podcast.
Oh, Kenny, it's really a pleasure to be with you. I know listeners won't be able to see us, but it looks like we're wearing similar designs on our shirts, maybe even the same color. Mine's blue and white. Yeah.
I'd like to say it's great minds think alike or style alike. That's
yes.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the themes in your latest book, Humility Illuminated. We'll get to that in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But first of all, every first-time guest on the podcast, we ask you 3 questions just to get to know you a little bit. So this is about things that you return to or things that are constants in your life. The 3 categories are a book you return to, a food or a meal you return to, and a place or a location that you return to. So first, let's think about a book that you come back to again and again.
That's hard. I tend not to. Oh my goodness. I wish I could think of something that I'm looking around my bookshelf saying, is there a book that I keep coming back to? There is a book that I use for devotional. Mm-hmm. It's a Minister's Guide to Prayer. So I come back to that. Sometimes I leave it and then I come back to it. So I'll go with that.
Great. Brilliant. And a food or a meal that you come back to?
That's easy. It's I'm from New York originally, and we pride ourselves on certain foods, but particularly pizza. And there's certain pizzas that remind me of my childhood, so I come back to pizza.
Gotcha. Now that must be a bit of a challenge because you're in Chicago now, right?
Oh, you're aware. Yeah, very good. And there's a little bit of a rivalry between Chicago style pizza and New York. So
that's right.
It is difficult. I was in New York a month ago and went out of my way to find pizza.
So is it a pie or is it a pizza? That's the thing. Yeah.
Yes. It's a pizza pie.
And finally, what about a location or a place that you come back to?
That's a little harder. I've moved around quite a bit. I think, can the place be metaphorical?
Sure.
Well, I'm an amateur musician and I play woodwind, saxophone and flute. And there's in my mind, it's when I was home as a child in the basement practicing my saxophone. I go back to that place in my mind when I'm practicing and when I'm thinking about how I'd like to be better at things.
Yeah. Wow, that's wonderful. Okay, well now based on those 3 questions, we know you well enough for you to theologize on this podcast.
All right, that's fine.
So the title of your book is Humility Illuminated, which kind of gives the impression that you're coming from a place where you think humility has perhaps been a little bit obscured or left in the shadows a little bit, and we need to shed light on it some more.
Very good.
So I just want to ask this first question about maybe some of the misunderstandings about humility, because it feels like humility is a virtue that's often ignored or misunderstood in our present
Yes.
church cultures.
Yes.
So maybe you can begin by talking about what are some kind of fundamental misunderstandings of humility that you have observed?
Yes, thank you for that question, and also for your observation about the title. We wrestled a bit with the title, and I wanted a descriptor, and I think, and the publishers were thinking, well, let's just call it humility. I wanted a descriptor because I thought people will fill in their own meaning of humility without some kind of descriptor. So
Yeah.
you caught exactly what I was going for, that I felt like humility has been obscured.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is we have this perception often that humility means continually um, diminishing ourselves in whatever setting we might find ourselves, or maybe in certain settings, we'll diminish ourselves in a certain way. So we kind of take it almost as degrading, that humility almost becomes humiliation, that I have to, really kind of degrade myself, see myself as insignificant. The other problem is we can interpret humility in a false way, to say, well, I'll come off as magnanimous, and I'll come off as as overly kind, so that I can get my way. So I think there's a misunderstanding of humility. It can be manipulative, or it can be seen as devaluing ourselves.
Yeah, because humility has kind of been adopted now in kind of corporate speak and strategy, hasn't it?
It has. In fact, I was in a gathering not long ago, and one of the persons in the group brought that very thing up and said, that humility can help people in the workplace to do better and such. And that's fine. I mean, I certainly would not disparage that. But I also think that if we have a limited view of humility, we still might miss how power works in certain settings. So if we just see it as merely a strategy how to get along with people, which is not bad. I mean, it does help us get along with people. But if we see it as a strategy to ultimately get my way in having a better or getting my way, and that maybe my status can increase in some way,
Yeah.
then I think we're really missing the point of humility.
Yeah, because I can take Jesus' words, right, and say, well, the last shall be first and the least shall be greatest. So I need to get down there, be last, be least, so I can get to the top. Which is kind of inverting Jesus' meaning, right?
Exactly right. We see it as a stepping stone to something else, rather than modeling the way of Jesus. I think you caught that well, and expressed it well. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the book, you make the point that humility, humiliation, they come from the same root. And I like where you took that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about groundedness, how we define humility in a helpful way.
Right. I think that word, a Latin behind it, humus, is for earth or ground. So I think groundedness is a good way to think about humility. We don't think of ourselves too highly, but neither do we need to diminish who God made us to be. And I think that there is an evenness to humility that is captured in there. Humiliation is something that others put onto us, but I think that humility is something we can embrace and adopt. But yes, there's an evenness to it. I use that word groundedness because earth and ground made me think that that's a good image of humility.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it'd be good just to think about the way that I think humility, when it's expressed well, can often feel a little threatening to others, because there does seem to be this kind of, it's almost like a quiet confidence or an assurance about who you are before God. I don't know if you've thought about it in those terms.
You expressed this very well, Kenny. I didn't say it as clearly in the book as you just did, but there is quiet confidence. I like that. There's somebody else wrote a book on humility, and called it something like confident humility. Well, I think confidence is already built into humility, but because it's what you said, there's this way of being where we are secure in our identity with God. So I don't have to see every interaction is confrontational, adversarial, or even competitive.
Hmm.
And that's disarming for some people because they want you to fight, or they want to get you into some sense that you have to prove something. And I think humility pulls that back. I think of the way of Jesus and conversations with certain leaders that the Gospels show us Jesus interacting with people, and the commentators or the omniscient narrators will say to us something like, they asked this to test him, or they, these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
So we know, the reader knows Jesus is being baited, but he doesn't take that bait. He doesn't enter into the argument the way they might expect him to, turns the tables. So for me, that's humility in the way it says, I don't have to fight the way you think I should fight. And that's disarming for some people.
Mm.
And also, there can be maybe associated with a certain aloofness that because you don't enter into the conflict the way some people expect, they might see you as perceiving yourself as better than and something. So there are all kinds of ways that humility can be misperceived, or but that's really not the problem for me, how others see it.
Mm.
It's really how I carry myself.
Yeah. Now you're in the US, I'm in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of shared cultural values between those two countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But one thing that it comes up again and again in the book is this idea of competition, and it seems to be something that you feel kind of distasteful about, this idea of a competitive culture. Maybe we could talk about how that interacts with humility.
Yes, and I was hoping it wasn't just my own personal idiosyncrasies, but because and I'm sure there are some of those in the book, but I feel like when we turn everything into a contest. Now that we right now is, I am thinking very much of my USA context, and I'm laughing because I think of gatherings where I thought they were neutral, like a potluck, bringing food to an event. Yet we have to then rate that, like who brought the best thing. And I thought, why does that have to be a contest? Why can't we just enjoy the food? But I remember being part of these, except some of the churches I served, and we'll have a contest for the bestest. I mean, it is fun to at times, I mean, I like games. I'm competitive in that sense. I like to play sports. I played sports most of my life. I like to play board games, card games, all that stuff. But I think there's a hyper nature to competitiveness when we have to prove that we're better than someone else, or we prove that we're better than this other group. To me, that's unhealthy.
Yep.
So I think it's built into our way of being. We just have to discern what kind of competition is healthy and perhaps maybe even benign in some way. But there's other kinds of competition that is really harmful, I think.
Yeah. I think, you kind of brought out this idea about humility makes you more like yourself, whereas pride makes you less like the true you.
Yeah.
And I think I'm looking across the ocean at what's happening in the political scene in the US. I'm thinking right now in the UK, we have an election underway. Without going down that road too far, I think what you do find is that certainly here, I've been listening the last couple of days about politicians who are unable to walk back certain things. They're persisting in things that everybody knows are a mistake, but they cannot let it go. They cannot say, I'm sorry for this, or I've made a mistake.
Right.
And the public feels the fakeness
Yes.
about that. There's a longing for authenticity that perhaps humility would actually bring out.
Well, I hope so. It's funny because we have these movies from time to time that show an idealistic way of life. Several years ago, I mean, way back, there's in our country, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This simple guy.
Yeah.
And then later there was a guy, I think it was called Dave or something, and he was a guy who looked like the president, but he was a kind person when the president was really very horrible. So we have this longing for authentic, genuine leaders. At least I think we do in the culture. But at the same time, there are many people who support and really bolster people that we know are lying, and are not genuine.
Yeah.
I don't understand that, except coming back to the competitive thing. It's sort of like, well, I'll back this person if they win, because if they win, then it becomes better for me. So we build in a certain, that competition's built in, and it's unhealthy, yet we'll accept their flaws if it's going to be bring something from me in it. And that's also discouraging for me to see that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I would love if we had a couple of hours to just kind of talk through all of the themes in your book, because you weave it
Yeah.
so well.
Well, thank
But
you.
I think we could probably break it down into two primary categories: this idea of
Okay.
humility before God and humility
Yes.
before others.
Yes.
So you frame attitudes towards God's attributes and His character as kind of foundational. It's
Yes.
in our own embrace of humility. We have to know who God is so that we can be humble in ourselves. Maybe you could unpack those
Yes.
ideas just a little bit.
Well, Kenny, I have to say I am enjoying this conversation because I feel like you really read the book. I've talked I've talked with people. I don't think they actually have understood some of the themes. You really captured that well. I felt like when I started with the Old Testament, or
Mm,
the Older Testament, as one of my colleagues calls it, we I saw humility attached um linguistically and conceptually to other notions that get at our relationship with God. For example, something the expression the fear of the Lord,
mm,
right? This respect and reverence and awe of God is sometimes put in parallel with the notion of humility, so that we're to see them similarly. This
mm,
notion of humility in my posture to God is like this, fear of the Lord. So I saw humility, as you said, foundational, or rather, maybe I say it this way: the foundations of humility are really my relationship with God. So, but when that's true, when I see myself in proper relationship to God, I yield to God, I submit to God, I revere God, I can grow then in my confidence in being a peacemaker and reconciler with other human beings. So that's the way I've seen humility play, at least the way I think the Bible plays it out. The kind of characters that we see in the Bible who are described as humble are people who have that disposition toward God and then can connect with their neighbor. One quick example I think of
mm.
is Ananias of Damascus, somebody that we read about in the book of Acts that God gives a vision to go and talk to this Saul of Tarsus. Saul has been persecuting Christians, and Ananias is put in this this awkward position by God to go and greet this person and welcome this person into the Christian community, and has to trust that God has done a work in that person's life. I view Ananias as humble,
Mm.
and then the way he's described in Acts uses the kinds of language and words that we would associate with humility. So his character before God, and then his reconciling and peacemaking work with Saul and the Christian community, to me illustrates what I'm trying to get at by this notion of humility.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that, but I like the way you framed it there. It's not just about Ananias, for instance, considering himself lowly before the Lord, but it's a willingness to trust
Mm-hmm.
and obey and
Yes.
to be someone through whom God's character
Yes.
is revealed to others, right?
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. I see that in the way the Old Testament talks about Moses, the way we see various characters in the New Testament. Now, I am saying characters because we see it often in a person, right, or
Mm,
in an event.
yeah.
But I also want to extend that out to say there are communities that can exemplify humility. So I try to say that in the book also, is that it's not just this one person in the congregation who's standing out like, oh, that's the really humble member, but it could be that all of us together create a an environment,
Hmm.
or an ethos or something that communicates to the world or to everyone else, to neighbors, that we are trying to follow the way of God, trying to understand who we are in God, and that prompts us then to be good neighbors to others.
Mm.
And I think that people will sense that humility even in a group setting.
Yeah, that's the hope, right?
That's the hope. Yeah.
And Micah 6, you have this idea of the connection of submission to God with goodness and justice and kindness and humility.
Hmm.
So it is this idea, it's not just a characteristic that's reserved for our interaction or our position before God, but it's about how we navigate the world. And
That's right.
I love this idea of humility as being the character of God expressed through us.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, that Micah 6, when you see Jesus in the book of Matthew, particularly, but I think about his confrontation to some self-righteous leaders. And that's still part of his humility, is that he can call out the injustice, but he says to them, woe to you. And then in his indictment, he says how they focused on these particular matters in the Torah, certain things that were, relatively, we could argue relatively insignificant, like tithing off of mint, dill, and cumin.
Mm.
He says, but you ignored the weightier matters. And he says things like justice, kindness, and how we relate to God, which basically is Micah 6:8. So he uses those three categories to say that's what would have been of more value, even than doing these particular deeds associated with the Torah.
And I'm glad you touched on that because thankfully, in His grace, God has demonstrated this way of humility through the incarnation. I think about Jesus in his humanity, but also the transfiguration, just ablaze with light, and the Father saying, "This is my Son, listen to him."
Yeah.
So through the incarnation, Jesus is revealing to us what it means to be humble humans and to live in this relationship with God.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about him.
Yes. That's wonderful. You said it well. My friend, and I like to think of him as a colleague, although he's so well accomplished, it's hard for me to connect us. But Michael Gorman has written so much on Paul and
Yeah.
has talked about Philippians chapter 2 as Paul's master story, as Michael puts it. And in there, he even talks about God's humility. And I think that I didn't express it that way. I thought of it as the Son, so humility, but
Mm-hmm.
yes, but it's even God's humility in a very whole sense of that. Um, when we have the gospel record of Jesus ministering on earth, and I pick on Matthew particularly because the language is very strong there, is that when Jesus welcomes others, he says, "Look, come to me, everyone who's weighed down and burdened." Right? He says in Matthew chapter 11, he says, "Take my yoke on you and learn from me." He says, "Because I'm gentle." He uses a word that's praus, which can mean, gentle or meek even. He says, "And I'm humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls." What a beautiful picture of a leader who says, "You can come to me and have your burdens eased, because I'm humble." So if that's the posture of Jesus as a leader, then I want that to be true of me too, is that people can, as a pastor or whomever I'm serving, or in my life as a Christian person, that people could feel comfortable coming to me and find a gentleness and a humility that allows me to help ease their burden. At least I want that
Yeah.
in my life. So we see that in Jesus' own proclamation about himself. And then in Philippians chapter 2, back to that place, that's when Paul urges humility between the community, and, don't just consider your own interests, consider the interests of others. And then he raises up Jesus as the example who humbled himself and became obedient, he says.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at with kind of the transfiguration idea is that
Yeah.
Jesus has the right to assert his power,
Very good.
to grasp for position, and he could do that, but he decides not to. He demonstrates his power and his position in this way of humility and of service, which is
Yes.
beautiful.
Yes, it is beautiful. And that's the language. It sounds so poetic to us. We think it's a hymn there in Philippians chapter 2, that he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped and held on for, personal gain, but rather emptied himself and took on this form of a servant. So you're right. I mean, we see in the transfiguration how magnificent Jesus is. At least we get a glimpse.
Yeah.
And then in to see in Philippians, but he humbled himself. I mean, that's remarkable. So if I say I want to be like Jesus, then humility is one of those things I want to make sure I don't ignore.
Yeah. Okay, so with Jesus as our example, and we've got this biblical narrative where we see humility kind of leaking out of people as they submit themselves to God.
Yes.
Maybe we can turn a little bit to some kind of contemporary
Sure.
issues and think about the church now.
Sure.
So, well, I know it is the case in the States, it is here as well, that self promotion seems to be
Mm-hmm.
a horrible issue in our church culture. It does make us lean into this comparison and competitive attitude. So I think it'd be good to think about that and then how we might see a different way forward, how humility might foster a different kind of church culture and unity.
Yes, I mean I've been concerned about this notion of self-promotion in the sense that, well, there's the real challenge that you might have something to say, something to contribute.
Mhm.
And the way our society is no one will listen to you unless you make a really big noise. It's the old Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hears a Who, right? We have to make some noise for people to know we're around and that we exist. And so it has turned, and of course with social media, that's turned into a whole business of making sure people know I exist and I have something to say. I, I can't see. I don't want to say it's evil for us to want people to hear our voices, but I would say we can get carried away with the notion that my voice is somehow more important than yours. So consequently, I'll do everything I can to push myself up there. And then you get people who are, sycophants, and they'll push somebody up there and such. Again, I think it's about power and grasping at significance.
Hmm.
So for me, I want to believe that when the Bible says in a few places, but it's clear here, at least relatively clear for me in First Peter, it says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. That's a refrain that travels throughout the Bible, right? God opposes the proud. And so he goes, so therefore, humble yourself under God's mighty hand, and in due time, he'll raise you up. So I want to believe that, even though in our world it's hard to grasp that God will do the raising.
Hmm.
We almost feel the pressure that I have to raise myself up because nobody else will do it. And when I say raise, I don't mean just the cry for dignity. I'm talking about the push to be seen as more significant and more important than others.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that humility seems to be a particularly important virtue for majority voices in the church to embrace.
Yes.
And I kind of see over the last few years, there's been a move towards reconsidering some majority positions and the way that
Yes.
people in the minority have been treated. But right now, there also seems to be kind of a pushback or a resistance to that move.
Sure.
I think about historic sins that need to be dealt with and confronted.
Yes.
But often majority groups will distract from that by appealing to individualism,
Yes.
right? So effectively, we're going to disconnect ourselves from our common history. And actually, we're going to kind of splinter our community right now because it's all focused on, well, I didn't do it, so it's not my fault. So why are we even bringing this up? This is all about disunity rather than bringing us together.
Wow. Wow.
You said a couple of things in your book that I really resonated with. One was you said that our corporate identity and common location in Christ do not deny individual responsibility, but rather enhance it. And you also said humility allows me to discern oppression even if I'm not the direct recipient of that oppression.
Yes.
So maybe we can talk about this connection in our churches between humility, owning what has gone wrong, and reconciliation and unity.
Yes. Yes. Wow. The way you describe the way majority culture can be um, almost dismissive of the pain of the minority, it
Mm.
sounds like the UK has some experiences that we have had over here, of course.
Yeah.
Well, the way I've been seeing this worked out in the Bible and the way I'm trying to see it worked out in our lives today is that I, I, I'm not diminished by showing love and concern for those who have been hurt, right? Um, so I don't see how I really lose my humanity in that. If anything, I gain in my
Mm-hmm.
humanity by being able to associate with the lowly. That's the way I see Jesus. So the way humility operates for me is to say, let me understand and hear and even empathize or enter in as much as I can to the plight of these people or this person that's sharing their pain with me. To me, that makes me a better human being, and humility allows me to listen without being defensive. I feel like we have lost the ability to empathize to some degree because we're busy protecting our own reputations. And again, I look at Jesus and say, well, he didn't seem to be worried about that um, so much as wanting to communicate God's love and God's concern for the world more broadly. So, yeah, I guess I'm maybe speaking in an idealistic way, but when it comes down to it, I feel like I'm called by God as a follower of Jesus to make sure that I don't, I'll say it positively, make sure that I listen to the voices of the people that God has said often get left out.
Mm.
And he's characterized them as poor, as widowed, as orphaned, I mean, as stranger, as alien, These are traditional groups that the Bible says gets left out, and we ought to pay attention to them. Humility allows me to be soft in my heart to that notion of listening to those folks. So even though I might not get treated like, I mean, I'm an African American, so I've had my share of issues, but I'm a man. So there are some ways that I get privileged over women at times. So if a woman is saying and explaining the hurt that she's faced, that doesn't diminish me.
Right.
That means that I can pay attention and become a better disciple of Jesus by respecting that pain.
And back to what you said earlier about our communities being places where humility is expressed, maybe part of that is that our church communities in the world become places where those voices are heard, and not just heard, but paid attention to,
Yes.
and that something is done about it, right?
Amen. That's what I would hope for,
Yeah.
that the churches could be those places, because if it's not the church, where else, right?
Right.
And so some people are leaving the church because they're not finding in church communities a place where they can authentically lament or express their concerns or their needs. And these are often not just selfish needs. These are often deep pains from the alienation that they faced in the world as ethnic minorities, as immigrants, as women. I mean, there are a variety of ways that people get marginalized in our world. And rather than dismissing them as not being able to, like, keep up with the rest of us or something, humility says, well, let me listen, and then let me do what I can to build something new. And it does, yeah. I mean, I think that's fair enough to say.
Yeah, and thank you for the way you've expressed that in your book, because I think the way you framed it is not just as something that's virtue signaling, but something that's rooted in a true,
Yes.
godly, biblical virtue.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Thank you.
So just a final question, I think, if we could just pivot a little bit. You are a theologian, an academic.
Yes.
We are a theological college, and so I thought it'd be good to just kind of think briefly at the end about humility in theological pursuit and thought.
Yes.
There's a one line at the beginning of your book. You say, doctrinal clarity surely has a place, but as the adage says, people won't care how much you know till they know how much you care.
Yes.
A clear way to show how much we care is to be open, honest, vulnerable, approachable, and generally unafraid of listening rather than talking. Humility allows us to have a posture that invites rather than repels.
Yes.
So we are a college who wants people to take whatever they're learning theologically and apply it in a real way in their living. I'm sure you're a practitioner in that way as well. So how can we avoid kind of the pitfalls of theological arrogance, of debate, of closing our ears to others, and really be humble in our theological pursuits in a way that affects the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's broad and it's good. I gave a lecture on that someplace where they were asking about power and humility in theological education. I think what I came away from that time, I'm trying to emphasize, is how important it is for even people who have studied a great deal, have a lot of knowledge, to continually show themselves to be students, that they're always still learning. And I think that's true of almost every faculty member and scholar I've ever met. And but also to not give the impression that they have all the answers. So when I was a seminary student, there were certain faculty I was in awe of, and some of them were pretty arrogant and acted like they knew everything. I mean, it was true. I went to a school, I won't say, but at one point the advertisement was, come study with the men who wrote the books. It was really this very much about, we're the experts. I don't see that as much anymore. I see many schools willing to say, come with your questions, come with who you are, and we'll try to help you discern some things. And so I just think even in our style of teaching, we can see it as a process where we're learning together. Not to say I don't have some specialized knowledge, but it is to say that I welcome you into that space, and I also want to know what you've learned and what you're thinking. And I know different cultures look at professors differently. Some, everything the professor says, I just got to get it and copy it. And others who don't, yeah, and they don't want to offer anything. They don't feel like they have anything to offer. But I do think the posture of the professor, if you will, is one of, we're in this together, learning and growing together. Yes, there are some things I've studied already and I know, and I feel like I want to share that with you, but I'm also growing, and some of my views might get reshaped and refined along the way. So that's more of a posture. I guess I didn't give specific actions as much,
Yeah.
but I like to see that kind of posture when I'm in a class.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really helpful. Well, listen, thank you, Dr. Edwards, for taking the time to speak with us. I would really recommend people to pick up the book, Humility Illuminated. I think just what you've said at the end there, I think it reveals an author who has a lot of lived experience and who's willing to share that, who has a confidence in what you're saying, but also an openness in your thinking. And I really appreciated the book. So, and this time with you has been a real blessing as well. So thank you for being a guest on Theodisc.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, really.
Well, thank you, Kenny and Rev Dr. Edwards, for highlighting to us how being grounded in Christ is what the true meaning of humility is all about. It doesn't mean that we are sorry for ourselves, but we rejoice in who we are in Jesus. In our next episode, Kenny is joined by Dr. Tamara Knudsen, who teaches on the Old Testament at WTC. They will be having a chat about the main focus of Tamara's PhD thesis at St Andrews University, namely oaths and vows in the Old Testament. In their discussion, they explore the nature of oaths and vows and how these impacted the entire trajectory of the biblical narrative. Insights abound in this episode. Thank you for listening to episode 39 of Theodisc. Join us next time for episode 40 with Tamara Knudsen as we look at biblical oaths and vows. Bye for now.